Well, with the crankshaft now sorted out and hopefully ready to go for the 350 BSA Model L from I think 1930, I've turned my attention to cleaning up the crankcases and getting the old main bearings out, and that's brought up a few things to share and discuss. And these are the bearings from the drive side. We got on the outside, the outermost bearing is a ball bearing, very worn one as it happens. That one is a 6305, and no problem and not very expensive to replace. I've already ordered a new set of bearings. So where we're looking at, hopefully, yeah, the drive side crankcase, this would have gone in first, followed by this spacer, followed by the outer race of this lipped roller bearing, which would go in obviously lip first. But crucially, we've got a spacer which was fitted between the two outer races, so they went in this order, and obviously then your inner race goes in there. But the way that the crankshaft is arranged and the way that the drive sprocket and shock absorber are fitted on the end of the crank means that when the actual sleeve nut in this case is done up to hold the assembly on the end of the crank, the sprocket and cush drive shock absorber assembly, it would pull the crank tight in, so you'd have all this bearing assembly sandwiched tightly between the shock absorber and sprocket and the obviously the crankshaft. But strangely enough, I've seen arrangements like this pretty frequently, especially on the many Royal Enfields I've worked on. But as well as having this spacer between the outer races, you usually have a spacer of a similar width between the inner races. But in this case there wasn't, so you just basically be doing the nut up either until it runs out of threads, or putting immense side loading on this lipped roller bearing, and as I'll demonstrate in a moment, you'd be pulling the engine sprocket and shock absorber assembly closer to the engine than they might be intended to be. And we've got that sort of polished area there where I'll demonstrate in a moment. I'll just nip and get the sprocket assembly and try and explain what I mean. Here's that engine shock absorber and sprocket assembly, and that is the sleeve nut that fastens it to the drive end of the crankshaft. This has got a tapered or chamfered end there, and that's been running against that and polishing it because it's been pulled tight up against the crankcase. Now, as well as that not being good, what it's also done is it's pulled the crankshaft over towards the drive side case further than it should have been. So we've ended up with the crank pin nut there, you might just see it on flywheel, merrily chewing and machining this away. Luckily it hasn't done too much damage, but the whole lot should never have been allowed to get over as close to this side as they obviously have. Also, once wear has taken place, and perhaps because the whole assembly has been able to then float about, especially as it's worn into this side as well, like that, what we end up with as well as that on the timing side is the crankshaft has also been able to wander over to the timing side far enough for once again the crank pin and its nut there to chew away at this. So the whole crank has been floating and clattering around from side to side, mainly thanks to there not being a spacer between the inner races of the drive side bearings. And the owner of the engine has given me a small handbook for this machine. It's not a full workshop manual, but there's a diagram in it, a sort of section drawing of the engine, and you can actually see that there is something between the inner races of these bearings in a drawing, but there was nothing there in this one. So what I'm going to endeavour to do is come up with a spacer the same kind of width as this one that fits between the outer races of the main bearings to fit between the inner ones, as I've seen on Royal Enfields, and I think that'll probably solve the problem and secure the crank laterally and stop it floating around and clattering against everything. And also it should mean that this doesn't get pulled in quite so far and as tightly towards the crankcase as it was last time around. So new main bearings, they're definitely going to help, but I think a major step forward will be having a suitably sized thickness spacer between them, and I think that will go a long way to help. Also, there's more. I think this engine has been in a bike which has been in some collision damage, and I'll just see if I can find it. Bear with me. It's this one, I think. No, sorry, here we are. Now if we look at the faces where the through bolts go through the engine and the engine plates and possibly the frame or whatever, you can see there's just a very slight raised, milled off sort of area where the bolts pass through and the nuts and washers do up against them, till we come to this one here, which is sort of a little bit chipped and damaged looking, and it's not the end of the world. It can be smoothed out and washers or whatever used instead. But on the inside we got on its corresponding face, oh no, here we are, sorry, here it is. It was actually it's actually another one. It's not, I'd assumed that I'd be looking at the other side of this one, but when I spotted what I'm going to discuss, it's actually in a different place. It's the other side of this one. We've got a crack there and a crack there. If I can possibly get it alloy welded up, I will do so. If not, it's not really the end of the world as such, because this bolts up against the corresponding face in the other half of the crankcase, and there's still a lot of material there. You've got one crack there, one crack there, all that there is good, and they clamp face to face tightly. And then of course you got all the studs all the way around holding the crankcases together as well, so it's not a major worry, but I will see if I can get something done about that, and if I can, so much the better. But if not, it's not the end of the world, but I'll see if I can smooth that one there out and conjure up some suitable spacers or washers as required. And because we've got to remember, we're working on something nearly 100 years old here, and we can't expect perfection or to have it like new, but what we can do is have it perfectly serviceable and usable, and that's the aim here. Otherwise it'd take forever and a day to sort this lot out and make it as it was when it was new. So what we're going to do is we're going to go for a good structurally sound engine that will run and perform very well once more, and that will be good enough for me, and I hope it'll also be good enough for the owner.